All right. How's it going, everybody? Uh, really psyched to be here, and thank you for everybody for getting up early with me um, to talk about men and periods. I'm going to start by just saying how humbled I am to be a part of this month-long campaign, hashtag Let's Face It, period, and particularly to NFCC International and Bush Timber for organizing everything. Um, so, uh, talking about men and periods, it's not, in my experience, something that a lot of my male peers think about or discuss a lot, and that certainly can lead into taboos around menstrual health, and um, it can also be used as a way to further explain perceived differences between men and women. I remember the first time this was brought to my attention was when I was in high school, and um, I was in high school, and I was I was talking to a girl, and she just wasn't responding to my messages at one point. And I asked one of the older guys on my basketball team. I asked him, what, like, why isn't she responding to me? And he responded, I don't know, man. Girls bleed out of their vagina once a month. They're like, you can't understand them. Um, so I found that to be uh, an interesting first social experience with talking about menstruation. Uh, and so, with that in mind, as powerful as stats are, um, in my experience, they don't result in an engaged male audience. And to give you some background on why my opinion has any my thoughts have any merit or experience on that is when I was in college, I founded an organization called Party with Consent. Um, this might come off backwards, but there's the logo. Backwards, of course. And now I travel to college campuses across the country speaking about sexual violence prevention and healthy masculinities. So I find that most of my work is presenting the conversation in a way that that can make guys feel empathized with, and just the way that I feel like they would actually listen and stay engaged. And so for me, that the experience of hearing a teammate on your basketball team explain the reason why somebody's not texting you back is because of a natural health process is not rational. So the conversation with a lot of men that I have to uh, do is recognize it not as a rational discussion, but more as a discussion around feeling. Um, and so that's why, as powerful as stats are, um, we usually my goal is to work to get to a specific exercise, and an exercise that we'll do here on this Google Hangout together, um, through storytelling. So through storytelling to get that sense of feeling there, um, to to plant a seed in considering why menstrual health and typically deemed women's issues matter to men. So with that in mind, the most important story for me to share isn't actually the one about for me as a man. for me to share stories of other people, or for stories of women who have shared with me their experiences, particularly with conversations around sexual violence, but also those around blatant sexism, and blatant sexism around menstrual health. But the most important story for me to share is about me as a guy, and what being able to break taboos around menstrual health does for me, because we all move based on our own selfish desires, and oftentimes the conversation around engaging men and typically deemed women's work is around honor or respect or integrity or being caring, and that's certainly admirable and important. But I've never discussed the idea of honor and integrity as a means to prevent sexual violence with the men who I speak with, because I don't think it's a sustainable way to have the discussion. And so with that, I wanted to dive right into a storytelling effort that is combined with an exercise that we'll do together, that I would do when I travel to college campuses. So the story goes, when I was a sophomore in college, I was named president of a group called Male Athletes Against Violence, and president or captain of my college's basketball team. So during this time, it was about just over a year since Male Athletes Against Violence was started on campus, and at the beginning, Male Athletes Against Violence had a lot of excitement around it. People wanting guys on their team to show up to the event, trying to get their captains to show up, trying to get the young kids to go, and we had pretty great attendance at a lot of our meetings. But slowly, as the conversation faded out of the public eye, fewer and fewer people started showing up, and making the full commitment. And particularly guys, fewer and fewer guys started showing up as the discussion became more in depth, and required more commitment. And that left me at a meeting one time when it was just myself and the president at the time, my sophomore year, Eric Barthold. And in the moment, I found myself frustrated as to why my male peers weren't seeing sexual violence on campus as urgent as I was, and I was, and that was making me frustrated in a lot of ways. And at that's the point where I engaged and considered what is it that makes this urgent for me. So rather than continuing to ask the question outward, why is there no urgency from why is there limited urgency from my male peers here at college? But rather, I could come to some sort of conclusion, something that I can control if I reflected internally and asked myself, why is it that I care about this? And why is it more urgent for me than my peers? So in doing that, in starting that reflection, I immediately go back to when I was 12 years old. When I was 12, I went to a basketball camp, and I wasn't expecting my dad to show up, but he did, and my mom was there to pick me up from camp, and it was sort of the closing ceremonies, and my dad showed up unexpectedly, um, and uh, and then my mom and I went back home, and then my dad took his car off to a meeting that was in that area, um, and then after that, my mom and I got home. I was so tired after this camp. I went to bed immediately and crashed, and then I and then I and when we got back, we didn't see my dad's car, but that was expected because he was going to his meeting. But then when I woke up in the morning, I looked out. I looked out the front window, and I still didn't see my dad's car, but I saw my aunt's car and my mom's best friend's car. And uh, when I walked outside on the porch, I saw my mom draped in a blanket, and I just saw her back. And then I went to sit next to her, and I she looked at me, and she'd clearly been up all night crying. And uh, what she said next was, "John, last night it was rainy, and Dad's car hit a skid, and his car went off the road, and he didn't make it." And uh, in that moment, there was a lot of shock. Um, but now, 12 years later, um, it's an interesting place of reflection for me to consider this uh, social construction of gender, um, which was sort of all thrown off for me in my experience, because I was my family was very much a nuclear family. My mom and my dad and me, every once in a while seeing face. So this was very much us three, and now the family turned into me and my mom. And uh, I'd like to say at this point, like, this is where my mom taught me all about um, feminism, but actually wasn't that. My my mom showed me an incredible sense of grit and toughness, um, that in in my subconscious, when I'm 12 years old, quote unquote, becoming a man, um, learn learn so much about this idea of toughness from what I could see my mom do, and what I could subconsciously see my mom doing for me. Um, and in ways when I was in high school and in college, the idea of toughness in athletics is oftentimes connected to uh, stories of objectifying women, or homophobia, and sort of outlashes of anger. And learning toughness from my mom, I couldn't envision something that was more weak than stepping on people, um, in order to prove your toughness. And so that's where I find a lot of my lessons around toughness and hard work and determination and accountability come from watching my mom uh, show me those forms of toughness, even when I was kind of surrounded by um, this, in my perception, false sense of toughness in playing basketball all throughout growing up. Um, and then the other part of that around the social construction of gender is my dad died, and so when we have the conversation about masculinity in a guided, intentional way, I find that most men point to their father, or the family patriarch, as the person who like they learned some of it from media and watching music videos and things like that, but the real lessons they learned from the men in their family. And for reasons out of my control, that just wasn't an option anymore. So interestingly, for me, it sort of left me as an unbiased person, where I'm going to college, and maybe there are some social cautions that men should have around thinking about sexual violence prevention, but I just didn't really feel any of those, because there was never a conversation about this is what men talk about and this is what women talk about, because I just had one perspective really in my family when it came to these significant topics, and that was my mom. So so coming into these experiences with this perspective around gender, that, and this is significantly helping me understand, you know what, this has a lot to do with why conversations of gender-based violence on campus are so urgent for me, when it seems that it's something to just pass by most of my male peers, and most of my peers in general. And so moving forward, I'm going to I head to college, and when I go to college, when I reflect on the sexual education that I received in high school, the main images that are clear are what my penis would look like if I got an STD, and there wasn't really much around the conversation about sexual consent and what it looks like, and so what I talk about is how when I went to college, especially with a single mom who was not ready to engage that conversation with her 18-year-old boy, I went to college with and my consent education was in the form of comedies that highlighted what college was going to be all about. The example that I use the most is Superbad, and in Superbad, there's these guys who are headed to college, and they're really excited, and it's the summer before college, and they really want to be friends for as long as they can because they're going to different colleges, and that sort of male bonding comes in the experience of also talking about girls, and particularly with these guys having sex with girls before they go to college, so they don't have to be considered weird or inexperienced. And so in one of these scenes, subconsciously, again, it's amazing when you put a context around Superbad for young men at college campuses around consent, and ask them, you know, what's happening here, because in the moment when you're watching comedy, you don't really think twice, and this is the sort of pervasive things that bring men to a place to not consider a conversation around consent the same way they don't consider the significance around periods being a taboo. And so basically one of the characters says, you know how girls are always waking up in the morning saying, oh, we got so shit-faced last night, we shouldn't have fucked those guys, we could be that mistake. And so examples like that are how I was educated around this. And so I think that story is pretty significant, and a significant parallel to my education around periods, is because when I have no form of real structure or engaged structure to really understand this and understand the significance, I'm left to remember the words of the older kid on my basketball team who just said, you know, don't listen to women because they bleed out of their vagina. So I think that really highlights something that's at the core of what I'm trying to do is it's not necessarily, and I apologize if this is what you're looking for on this, it's not necessarily actively explaining this is what you should do. It's asking the question, where did you learn that? So when I ask men, where did you learn sexual consent? They often have the same story as I do, and I can imagine in the same frame when I ask what does it mean to be a man. They have a similar question that I do. There's never really been any intention around it. It's just something that you sort of learn as you go. And part of that story being how, where have you learned about periods, and when there's no intentional conversation around it, that's basically the most important part for taboo and like false ideas to creep up is when it's just like in these stories that are passed down and not based in reason. So again, bringing it back, the idea that some of these assumptions come to not being based in reason, so it would be difficult for us to engage in the form of saying, like, let's just be reasonable about this when there's so much history around it that's not reasonable. So engaging with stories to combat that, to get into the feeling rather than the rational thinking brain is, again, what we're trying to do when I tell the story about my father dying. I tell a story about learning consent from movies and comedies before I go to college, and then moving into it again, going back to this vision of myself and Eric. We're both sitting at a table, and we were both pondering what's putting us here when most of our peers aren't showing up. And the final part of the story is when I was a freshman in college. One of my before we get into that, the conversation around my dad dying when I was young, I was hoping I wanted to bring that to an exercise and then share the other stories afterwards. So I apologize about the break, but so coming back. So when I was in high school and college, when I was watching these comedies, as much as I was subconsciously being educated around masculinity and consent and sexual education, I was curious. When I was told, John, your dad's gone now, and you're the man of the house, I would look at my friends' dads and I would say, yeah, I know, I got this, but I wouldn't really know what they were talking about. I could make assumptions, but again, without any intention around that conversation, I was left to just sort of guesses. And same thing when I was on the basketball court, then a coach would say, go out there and be a man. I'd have an idea of what I was supposed to do, but again, I would nod my head and say, yeah, I got it, but still not totally be sure what that meant. And then even when I would go to parties, and friends said, like, older friends said, go out there and be a man tonight, John, I would say, yeah, I got this, but wasn't really sure what it meant. So for me, I was curious about this for a long time. And I was curious about this for a long time, and subconsciously and then consciously, what is this conversation about? Like, what does being a man mean? And the most clarity that I ever had around this was through doing an exercise that we'll do together here, called the Man Box. And Eric, the president of Male Athletes Against Violence at the time, showed me the Man Box. And it took a couple of times to fully comprehend and understand. But it's a very simple exercise. It consists of just 3 questions. And we'll get into it right now. So I don't know if you can see this in the chat, but I just put out my Twitter handle, and I have my phone right here, and so I'll do most of it, but I'll ask under the hashtag manbox, if you have any answers to the prompts that I share. And so what I'll do is, on this sheet of paper, it'll be backwards, but it'll make sense. On this sheet of paper, I'll write down everything, and it'll make sense as we go. So the first question in the man box is, based on our society's standards, what defines a real man? What are some phrases that come to mind? So if you can use this group chat, go ahead and use it. If you can't, feel free to shoot me something on Twitter through the handle at Jonathan Kalin, or you could do at party W consent, if that's easier, with the hashtag manbox, and just something like society currently defines masculinity as defines a real man as. And I can start off with some of them, and wait to see what comes in. So the first thing that most students share is something about a real man's appearance. So a real man is strong, probably athletic, put together. So like sort of the opposite of somebody who might look homeless or something like that. And I should say too, the Man Box was founded by a cool organization out in Oakland, California. And now there's all sorts of variations of it that I've been lucky enough to see all sorts of other awesome men share in their healthy masculinity work. So I'll keep going and wait to see any of these come in. But strong, put together, athletic. There's a sort of like a rugged guy, rugged, tough, confident, in control. Now we're moving into sort of like his personality types: in control, confident, tough, oftentimes stoic. So if I'll ask, how does a real man interact with his feelings? A lot of people say he doesn't. He doesn't have feelings. Doesn't cry. And then so moving into some more fun questions, question about what type of car does the real man drive? And depending on where you are, sort of varies between some sort of truck or some sort of really expensive sports car. And then conversation about what does a real man drink? And it's some sort of scotch or a heavy beer. What else is a real man? There's all sorts of variations of those two that you hear from different regions. And and then the question about what is this guy's relationship with women? Uh, who like how does he engage with women? And it's when we're talking about a real man, um, it's a lot of times um, the the conversation is around multiple sexual partners, nobody who you're too serious with, but clearly seeing women as sexual objects. So women as sexual objects, multiple partners. And then you can imagine for this conversation, what does a real man think about menstrual health? He'll probably say something along the lines of "that's weak" or "that's stupid" or "I don't want to know about that." So together, I'm not sure if you can see those well, but these are some of the phrases that are consistently used to define a real man. And so the second part of the man box is asking the same question, but for a different hypothetical person. So this time we're going to describe a not real man. So the times when you see a man and you think, wow, like that guy's just got to get it together. He's such a not real man. Thinking about what are the first phrases and ideas or thoughts that come to mind, and feel free to use that hashtag for it as well. I'm just going to check to see. Okay. So the first thing that comes to mind is appearance. So, maybe this guy's overweight. He might have glasses and acne. He's not really put together. He's sort of disheveled. And when thinking about his personality, he's considered weak. He is hesitant. He's cautious. Not risk averse. What else is he? This man's very much in the man box as we described. He's very much in touch with his emotions. So can be emotional, can cry. So not always in control, not always severed off from his emotional self. And then again, the fun questions. What does the not real man drive? Basically, with 100% certainty, the moment I ask that question, the room of college students says Prius. So I don't know if that was intentional branding on Prius's part, but for the millennial generation, Prius is the car of the not real man. And then grumblings of, like a Beetle, or he doesn't even drive a car, he has a bike. And then the question of what does the not real man drink? Basically any form of sugary alcoholic drink, like an apple teeny comes up, hard lemonade. Sometimes really clever students will recognize I didn't even say alcoholic drinks. So they'll say something like water or Sprite. And then when we ask about this man and what is his sorry, just checking to see. So with this man, to see if his what his relationships with women are, and across the overwhelming response to this, although it's not as choir-like as Prius, is the term friend zone. And friend zone describes a man who has many female friends, but no female friends who really want to be sexual with him or are interested in a relationship with him. So the guy who has all the emotional phone calls, but then doesn't have sex with the women that he talks with. So friend zone, multiple girl space or dash friends. Multiple girl dash friends. So yeah, so that's a pretty solid list for the not real man. So again, apologize that it's backwards, but so we have on the outside, friend zone, multiple girl dash friends, drinks hard lemonade, appletini, drives a Prius, and these are all words to describe the not real man. And then in the middle, we have confident, rugged, stoic, in control as a description of the real man. And so the last question, which will shed a lot of light on why this exercise is significant when considering the taboos around menstrual health, is what happens when men fall outside of the box. So when a man drinks water at a bar, or when a man is overweight, or when a man shows weakness, or when a man is hesitant or risk averse, or drives a Prius, or cries, certainly when he cries, what happens is the next question is, what do we call that man? So when he's no longer in the box, he's falling outside of the box, what do I would often say we as men, but we as everybody call that man. And again, feel free to tweet at me or tweet at the hashtag manbox. But so this conversation, when I'm not doing it over Google Hangout, when I'm doing it in person, I say, for educational purposes, we're putting quotes around these words that are not meant to demean others in the way that they are intended to, but we want to have a real conversation. So let's talk about the real words that we use. And so that'll start off with like wuss or sissy. And so it takes a little pushing to get past that. But then the words that are just basically 100% anywhere you go. When a man cries or falls out of the man box, isn't tough, shows weakness. Dude, why are you being such a pussy? Don't act like a girl. Don't be a little bitch. And then on the other side, another conversation that is at the core of thinking about the masculine gender performance is the homophobia. So dude, that's so gay, or don't be a fag. So overwhelmingly, the strongest forms of insults, the strongest forms of challenges to identity that push men back into the box are calling them women-like or girl-like, or calling them gay. And with that in mind, number one, so there would be a lot more. And what's really interesting is that every regional area has like a specific word to insult people. So like in Washington, a group of guys said like jabroni, like you can't be called jabroni. And then in different cities, there's always like one word that I've never heard before. So so together we have this set up here. So what's a real man on the inside, around the outside on the top is what's a not real man. And then on the bottom are words that describe a not real man, or are used when we see a man not being a real man. So this is what a man box looks like. And so what is basically happening is that these words are being used to push men back into the box. I wish I could draw, but it's too difficult. Yeah, so these words that are connected to some derogatory way of describing a woman or a member of the LGBTQ community is an effort to push men back into the box when they are not being quote unquote manly enough. So number one, when we describe men as aggressive, tough, confident, and in control, we heterosexual men as that, we number one create like a false social hierarchy that says that gay people and women can't be that. And that's number one when I talk to students, is that when you want to think about something you can do, the seriousness of how much your language can, your publicly shared language can do to make it feel as though this environment is not supportive of women or the LGBTQ community, just by saying things, even if you're saying like, I don't mean it, like I have a gay friend, or like I really have a sister and I care about her. The use of these words is an effort to, number one, push men back into the box, but it's also an effort to teach other men that women are weak and not as strong as you. And so that's the first really significant outcome. And then the second one is around this idea of feeling. And so what puts men in this box is a sense of feeling, the embarrassment that you can feel when your friend calls you a bitch for not doing something, or when you're called a pussy for not being strong enough in sports. It's as much sometimes people try to flip it and say, well, I don't see anything wrong with that. When you take it out of hypothetical and you place people in a space, place guys in a space and say, like, what if in this point in time this guy just called you a bitch? And he would respond and say, yeah, that would make me really mad. So the second part of the experience is the more internal one, just to guys. I talk to a lot of men who are thinking about this, and a lot of times the conversation about mental health or feminism exists outside of us, and that's certainly right, as I can't say I've ever had a period or know what that feels like. But what I'm not reconciling is the fact that the way society is set up around the social construction of masculinity is that I can't really always show publicly everything that I am, and the effort to expand this box to allow men the opportunity to cry if that's how they feel. And when I consider myself as a 12-year-old, after my dad died, this box wasn't doing me any favors. I thought that I was showing immense weakness and vulnerability if I cried about my loss, and that didn't allow me to properly grieve and be in a position where I could speak openly about my dad dying when I'm suddenly. So the opportunity to show that that what was in it for me was the opportunity to be my authentic self, to show my true feelings. That had everything to do with my healing process, and that the expectations around the masculine gender expression didn't allow me to fully show that and thus fully heal until I realized that it was a social construction, and that these things that were so controlling when I didn't think about them intentionally didn't really matter that much. So so when we consider why it is something that men don't want to talk about, or something that men just say is gross, there's certainly an aspect of empathy that that we hope to inspire, and I do that in a different effort when I'm on a college campus with a different story leading into a different exercise. But it's secondly about, what about you? What happens when women have to be closeted about this this experience that they have every month for a week or so? What do you have to be closeted about then as a guy? And what does that do to you? What does that do to your own health? And it's not to say that that's comparable to NFCC International and Bush Timber. Certainly are more well versed in the stats and the numbers. As I said, mine's more about storytelling. But the women all over the world who, when they get their period, they can't go to school, and that has to do with a taboo and not talking about it. And then similarly, and I hope men can understand in a way that's certainly threatening, as in the form of embarrassment, but not threatening in the form that, like, you're not going to be able to go to school. A man or a young boy openly crying in a classroom and being called a bitch, or being called a pussy, or being just made to feel weak in all these different ways. Living into these cultural norms that are defined by not by reason or rationale or logic, but by feeling, puts us in a place where we too, as men, have to sever off a part of our true selves in order to perform in a way that people like or expect. And so for me, the conclusion of the man box, particularly around the conversation of menstrual health, is if women have to be closeted and closed off about something they experience every single month, what is it that us as men are closeted about every single month? And what is it that not having a genuine conversation, or not learning from women about this process that they all experience, what is that doing to hinder transparency, and thus hinder fulfilling relationships, and thus make us all less capable of being our true selves? So on that note, with 7 minutes left, I'm not going to be able to share the other stories that I was telling you about, but there were a couple questions that came in that I'll address in the last 7 minutes. And yeah, feel free again to tweet at me if you have any other questions. But here we go. Okay, so some of what I explained already, but I'll try to recap it briefly. What can guys even do about this? Isn't it just a woman's issue? Yeah, I think we talked about that a lot. My effort is a lot more abstract So I don't really have a 1, 2, 3. This is what you can do. But I know that the conversation about this exists on like a sexist foundation. So your ability to avoid sexist language, particularly sexist language in a sense of promoting your own toughness and pride, certainly is something to do. And again, as I tried to bring it to a whole at the end, this certainly isn't just a woman's issue. We all experience gender, definitely, and I like women brought gender to the attention of the world, so it's certainly more urgent and and serious when it comes to the threat of violence that women face in their homes all the time. But that's not to say that men don't also have constraints around what they're allowed to do as men. So this really concerns all of us, the opportunity to be transparent and be truthful and not be so concerned with performance. Next question is, it's gross, I don't want to hear about it, and what's the point of having a national conversation? Well, the point of having a national conversation is to sort of present how, again, like in a not intentional space, periods can certainly be seen as gross. So in the same movies that I watched, actually in Superbad, there's a pretty clear joke about periods being really, really bad. And so in that context, it can be learned like really quickly, whoa, like this is so gross. But in an intentional, like grown up context, we sort of come to a conclusion around this isn't gross. Like, in fact, it's gross to not have the discussion, because not having a national and international global conversation about it is limiting people in the world from getting education, which is scary and certainly more disgusting than considering a natural bodily function. Aren't there people starving that need to be fed? Why focus on periods? Sort of answered that similarly. And that's a slippery slope, that question. So we basically can ask ourselves that about anything. Yeah, like why are you eating breakfast if other people are starving? It's like it's not a zero-sum game, or it is, but it's that you can be concerned about multiple human topics. And again, the idea that a lot of this affects some people so much that it prevents them from going to school, I think that's a serious concern. I'll try to run through the next three. Why is it so important to change guys' attitudes about menstruation? I think it's important because what's most important, I think, about having guys in the conversation is that when I'm looked at as objective, because I can't be talking in my own self-interest, because I'm not a woman and I've never experienced I've never had a period. I never had to experience menstrual health for myself. So in the same way that when we describe sexual violence as typically a women's issue, when women speak out about it and male allies leave them isolated, it's really easy for the discourse to turn into that person speaking out of self-interest. That person isn't really that's like not really the truth. But when a person who can't be speaking from their own interest because they haven't experienced it brings light to it also, it in ways that I really wish we existed differently socially, but it actually gives a lot more merit to the discussion, and in ways too that I think gender is understood homosocially. So men teach gender to men and women teach women gender to women, hearing about taking menstrual health seriously from a man to another man, in ways, again, that I'm just being realistic, carries more weight than maybe hearing it from a woman in their lives. Because if that did carry weight, a lot more men would be aware of it. So yeah, you number one, you won't be seen as talking in your own self-interest, which is huge. And number two, more guys will listen to you just because you're a guy. What is my experience with periods? I sort of shared that. It's not a ton. A whole lot of watching comedies that taught me that they were gross and things that were not worth thinking about or talking about, and a reason, a biological reason to name women as weak or weird or different, or not as good as men. How can guys help and support women and their periods? Again, the last one I'll take. Again, I'm not an expert on periods, but I certainly do know that when you're talking about breaking down a taboo, engaging in a conversation, being curious, and talking about this with women, I found in a way that's in a way that's authentic, is I think a really significant part of just breaking down the taboos in general, but also a significant part of showing genuine care, because it's sort of easy to play into the typical masculine protector or provider role when you consider care, but considering another layer, which is around health, and what is what is the taboo that you're ready to push through to show support. So I would understand that very much on the broader ideas of sexism, but I'm sure NFC International and Bush Timber will update and have more specifics on ways to be supportive. So we're about a minute over 9. Thanks everybody for joining me here, and please continue the conversation. Feel free, again, in the comments, in the chat over on the side is both my Twitter handle and Party with Consent's Twitter handle. And yeah, stay engaged with the month-long campaign. And thanks again for having me. Bye-bye.